Spike Ops Info Podcast, Episode 7, Madeleine. Welcome to the Spike Ops Info Podcast. I'm Tom Fowler. I'm joined with
Chris Bryan from the Undercover Research Group.
And for the first time,
Madeleine.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I guess you're the first person who the inquiry has found to give evidence about intimate sexual relationships.
I got doorstepped by the inquiry last February.
What was that like?
It was actually quite bizarre and quite surreal because it was early one Saturday morning, knock on the door, and husband opened the door, and there's a guy there with a kind of very sober looking, suit, tie, looking very serious, with a white envelope, asking, if I lived here. And he said, sorry, who are you? What's this all about? Kind of thing. And it was all very, I'm sorry, but I can't tell you. I need to speak directly to her. And I'd overheard this and kind of came to the door thinking, God, what's happened? This sounds pretty serious. And I was kind of expecting some really horrible news, because I thought, immediately I thought, what have I done? And then thought, I haven't done anything. Or is it some bad news about somebody? And then he, I just said, it's okay, you can talk in front of him. And he had this letter for me that it had to be hand delivered. It was all a bit kind of, it was unnerving. Let's put it that way, unnerving. And then he said, I'm from the Undercover Policing Inquiry. Have you heard about this? And then I kind of guessed, because I had actually seen Vince Miller's name. I think when it was first published, but it just had a list of names and it had this name. And I thought, hang on, I knew someone called Vince. Was it the same Vince? Couldn't remember the surname, kind of thing. And then assumed probably wasn't, because no one's contacted me. So kind of put it out of my mind, just kind of thought, no photo, no way of actually knowing who it, whether it was the same person. And I'd had no reason whatsoever in the kind of intervening years to ever think, that he was anything other than a member of the SWP. Once I'd opened the letter, which didn't actually give me very much information, it just said that I'd been named as a victim of undercover policing, and then they said they'd get in touch with me, or if I wanted to get in touch with them, there was no obligation for me to become involved. And then I waited a long time, because then COVID happened. The world shut down. It seems that they shut down for a period of time, and eventually, I think I called them and had a chat, and was then given this information that there's all this information about me, intelligence information about me, which I wouldn't be able to see unless I signed a restriction order. So it was all sounding very, very serious and kind of a bit scary, thinking, God, what on earth have they got on me? And what's the restriction order? This all sounds kind of, very serious, and I think initially we were thinking, what's the point of getting involved in this? It's going to be a whitewash.
That's a really common reaction and a totally understandable one. I wouldn't blame anybody for doing that.
Yep, and thinking, what will come from it? What's the point of getting involved? But it was the knowledge that there's intelligence, there's information, there's files. It's not just that, you were a member of. There's actually files on you. And I thought, well, I have to see those files. I can't let this go. I have to see the files. So yeah, then the restriction order, I had to agree to the restriction order, which was ridiculous, because it was all very, can't tell anyone, on pain of death almost, or they'll lock you up and take away all your assets and everything if you reveal the contents of the files, which were about me, which seems absurd. And then when the files actually came, a lot of the information was just about public meetings, so there was a kind of run-of-the-mill descriptions of meetings, discussions, etc. Bits redacted with, which I couldn't see, but then lists of names that I could see. So, everybody that was at the meeting, I could see all their names and my names and everything. And I thought, well, apart from the privacy of those people that might not want everybody to know that they were a member of the SWP or at that meeting or whatever, I thought, there's hardly any great state secrets here. It's why is there this big restriction order? It was an anxious time, waiting to kind of get these files and reading them and everything.
It seems such a strange process the way they've done it, and what's really kind of angered a lot of activists is that they didn't put you in touch with the Police Spies Out of Lives support group at all, which is something that would been requested, that if they are going to contact women who've been affected, that they put those women in touch with other women who've been affected.
No, it didn't happen. And in fact, I found out later that there was an agreement, already existing agreement, that I would have been contacted by a woman, and instead I was this kind of very serious, sober, I thought he was a policeman actually when he turned up, kind of guy, and so there wasn't much thought given to it. There wasn't much kind of sensitivity, and as this process has gone along, if it weren't for the brilliant legal team who are absolutely brilliant, and all the women and you guys and everything like that, I think I would have, if I'd have felt that I was on my own in this process, I would have thought, much harder about carrying on with it, because it's much more stressful than I ever thought it would be. It's so legal, if you see what I mean. It's this whole courtroom type sort of setup, which is really intimidating. And if you're not, kind of familiar with all the kind of the legal processes, the language, all of that, it's quite alienating, really. It's not civilian friendly, let's put it that way.
And you weren't even allowed to share the evidence bundle or the intelligence reports with your husband. Is that correct?
That's crazy. So when they came, I said, you can't look at these, and he's saying, don't worry, I won't. And it just seemed ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. The fact is, when they turned up, they were so hard to read. They were just ancient, kind of grey, kind of like as if they'd been photocopied about 500 times. And I had to get magnifying glass, and I'm peering at these things, thinking, what on earth is this? And eventually, I think, the lawyers had the same problem, and we tried to kind of get better quality copies and everything, because it was impossible to read some of the stuff. The whole thing was absurd, and it put that kind of unnecessary strain and stress when obviously you need kind of support, emotional support, when you're kind of going through things like this. And then to feel that, me just accidentally saying something could, this great bolt of lightning would come out of nowhere and, just crazy.
Well, thank you for persevering. I think you were an excellent witness. I think there was a sea change in the attitude of the chair after you gave evidence. It's hard to read too much into it, but I think that your evidence really kind of marked a bit of a turning point in the attitude, to a certain extent anyway. Because I was there, obviously, in the viewing room, listening to your evidence when you gave it. I got quite upset by the sort of the line of questioning. It was quite aggressive and hostile in places, and it seemed like Ms. Hummerstone was trying to catch you out on like minor details a lot of the time through the questioning. How did you find the whole process?
It's tricky. It's very tricky. I think it didn't feel aggressive to me, mainly because I was quite well prepared by Kate. So we were kind of expecting, we knew that there would be lots of questions about violence, although I was then beginning to get a little bit, God, another question about violence. You know, it seemed to be a bit kind of relentless. And, you know, then in terms of the relationship stuff, I think because because we knew that there was this, you know, discrepancy between his version and my version, that, you know, there would be, this conflict would give rise to close examination, let's put it that way. I was prepared, you know, prior to that. I was thinking, if it starts getting invasive and I start feeling really, really uncomfortable, I was ready to say, hang on, you know, I'm sorry, but this is, where are we going with this? Because, you know, this is beginning to make me feel really uncomfortable. It seems really invasive. It seems unnecessary, and I'm not going to answer it, you know, and I was prepared to do that. But I kind of felt as though she kind of pulled back. You know, I don't know whether she'd ever had any intention to go there, but it did feel that, you know, she didn't quite cross the line, but because of the nature of the conflict, you know, because I'd seen, and I think this kind of goes back as much to, I'd written my statement and everything without having seen what he'd said at all. I hadn't seen anything about this, so I'd written my statement. You know, I knew that there was, you know, that he's basically saying he had 4 one-night stands, which, you know, in my case, it wasn't a one-night stand. So and then after I'd written my statement, I was shown a tiny snippet of his statement, or his revised statement, where he'd basically said something like, I unexpectedly invited him into my bedroom, which completely out of context of anything. And I thought, so he's, you know, what's he trying to say? And drink had been involved. So what's he saying? I'm some kind of, you know, I'm some drunken slut that's just leapt on him unexpectedly. And that's, you know, so I kind of felt that that had to be pushed back on, really. So then I knew it was going to kind of get a bit what happened. So yeah, I mean, I could understand though how other people listening to it must have felt. I was so nervous prior to it that I was almost kind of not slightly detached from my body, as it were, but it was, I was just kind of concentrating on kind of getting through it without just completely freezing and messing it all up, really. But yeah, I can understand how other people felt, especially, you know, I think some of the other women are have been really impacted by this, you know, been really messed up, you know, by this whole thing. And to some extent, I feel as though I kind of got off lightly. It was a short relationship that was many years ago. I'm quite a kind of tough, robust person. So I felt that, you know, and other people may not be, and you know, they really need to think about how this kind of goes forward for them. So if it could be used as a kind of learning exercise, you know, good. I'm glad about that. But obviously some of the other women need to be kind of questioned in a much more, or even, you know, whether even they should be questioned. You know, it all has to be dealt with in a much more sensitive way for them, because, you know, the danger is that people get re-traumatised, you know, and it's obviously impacted their lives hugely, you know, in a really negative way already.
It's a big problem with this whole process, isn't it? Because, you know, as activists, we want to try and like kind of push at every like level we can to get more truth, get more understanding of what they were actually up to, sort of, you know, kind of all that. That's not what the inquiry's trying to do. The inquiry's got a very limited thing, and there's some overlap there which we get to like push at. But is it worth, like you say, is it worth the re-traumatising of people? I mean, it's a really difficult question. I think it's really difficult.
Yeah, well, it's hard, but I think it's this whole kind of courtroom legal type kind of setting that it's kind of happening in. And, maybe they need to kind of pause, rethink the way that everything's done, find a more kind of creative, more sympathetic, more kind of human way of kind of carrying on, because it does seem so process focused, and it does feel as though, what with the restriction orders and the redactions and everything, and there's this examination of our politics, as if to say, well, come on then, justify yourself. Why were they spying on you? And yet, I was thinking, and then you hear the questioning of the police and the questioning, apart from Vince Miller, where they did actually kind of get tougher with him. The whole questioning of the police has been fairly dry, hasn't it? It's all been about, what was the training like? Where were you living? Did you have a cover vehicle? It's all that type of stuff. And I thought, actually, I'd like them to start exploring the psychology of these guys a lot more, because I think that it's like the elephant in the room, isn't it, really? Because you think to yourself, let's start asking them about their politics. Were they racist? What do they think about women? Were they sexist? Did they have sympathy for the NF? What did they feel about lying and deceiving? Not just women, but everybody else. We're all brought up with this kind of, moral code, aren't we? About being honest and being open and being truthful, and, especially, with people, and having those types of relationships. The fact that their remit is so the opposite of that, where they're deliberately lying, deliberately deceiving. How the hell do they lie in bed next to somebody that they're spying on? It's just, this I find is a really kind of fascinating aspect that's just not being explored at all. And I'd like to see a lot more tough questioning about that for them, really.
And one of the things that I suppose that we've learned from this tranche to some extent, from this group of hearings, was pretty much, except maybe for Graham Coates, they all defended their operations in very what I call like a general or corporate defence. They said, we did it because X might have happened. But when it came down to concrete examples of what they actually stopped happening, which was so terrible that it may or have possibly justified all this, I can't actually think of one single example of anything they actually stopped. Or, I mean, can you?
No.
Totally missing, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard about the two killings, the punching of in the face by the undercover copper. We heard about the other undercover officers that were on demonstrations and then were attacked by the police, completely indiscriminately suddenly attacked. So they're aware of the level of police violence in those situations. And yet, apart from maybe one or two of them saying somebody got a bit hot-headed and may have kind of shouted at the National Front, and maybe somebody, threw a punch somewhere along the line, it's all, and then obviously, what's becoming apparent as well is how aware they were of the violence of the National Front, because, Vince Miller himself said he first came into contact with the SWP sellers at the top of Walthamstow Market when they were being confronted by the National Front. So it's like, and in those days, it was, far right violence was a real thing. It wasn't a kind of, it was happening, not just, we know about all the racist killings, the fire bombings and all the rest of it, and they were also attacking the left. So yeah, it's these are the things that are being revealed.
I mean, I think it's something which is really missing from the inquiry is like the actual the sense of the far right violence that existed at that time. We kind of got glimpses of it being mentioned, but we didn't really, within the context of it, it really felt like there was the way that the Special Demonstration Squad were operating was, by not even thinking about the way the National Front were carrying on, but like targeting anti-fascists, that they were essentially supporting the far right.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions was asked from our side for the council for the inquiry to ask was, why didn't you? Because it did seem that a lot of the undercovers had a kind of a choice which groups they infiltrated, most notably Graham Coates, but also mainly they seemed to have to be able to pick and choose, and it was put to them, why didn't you choose to infiltrate a far right group? And I think Miller and perhaps and one other one said, well, they weren't really a threat at the time, which is completely... Did Miller say that as well?
Did he say they weren't considered? I mean, I don't know whether he meant him.
That's right. They didn't come under the heading. Yes, that's right. They weren't categorised as...
But other undercover officers were saying things like, well, they weren't a problem. Like this sort of absolute kind of like... And we see this a lot, I think, from the establishment, where, that far-right politics is like kind of classed as being legitimate white working class concerns, whereas, left-wing politics is somehow like subversion and like kind of working for foreign powers. And there's so much of that kind of still informs, I think, the outlook of the people who are running the inquiry as much as the undercover police back then.
Well, I thought it was telling when I think it was not just one. I think a couple of the officers said something like, well, what did you count as subversion? Well, whatever they told me was subversion. So it's like this kind of authoritarian kind of mindset. I'm just doing my job. I don't think. I just do as I'm told, which I find very, very chilling. That we have people in positions of authority and power. Maybe that's why they get into positions of authority and power. I don't know, but there's a definite kind of psychological, kind of thing going on there. I can't remember which officer it was. No, I think that was actually in a report that the one of the police reports, and they were talking about one of the problems is when it did eventually start to infiltrate the right, was that none of the UCOs wanted to do it, and they felt real antipathy towards the people that they had infiltrated. So if there was a kind of like a break for a while, they didn't want to go back in because they found them, I think it was violent, bigoted, and crude.
I think that's in the Bob Lambert report, isn't it?
That's right.
On Mike Chitty, yeah.
Yeah, and I would add, and there were no pretty girls, So where would you rather go? Where would you rather go? But yeah, talking about, far-right violence, it was something that David Barr actually asked Vince Miller when he was probing him about, did it ever kind of go into kind of vigilantism, kind of thing, this defending communities and all the rest of it. And there's a point that I'd wished I'd made when I gave my evidence, but it kind of gone out of my mind. And I think it was brought up talking about the Dagenham clan. Yeah, and them saying, and her saying, what did you do? And after I was thinking, why didn't I say, this is, and what actually happened was they were attacked. The brick goes through the window and all the rest of it. They were so petrified that people went down in a rota, and what they actually did was barricade the door from the inside. So they barricaded, I didn't go, but friends of mine did, barricaded themselves inside. So
this was a family who were attacked by these local fascists in Dagenham.
In Dagenham, that's right. So it was a white... in those days, Dagenham, it's changed now, but it was wholly white. It's the huge council estate, wholly white at the time. And I think she was black, or mixed race, black, and he was Jewish. The boyfriend was Jewish. I think that's what it was. Yeah, and a brick was thrown through the window, which was wrapped in a far right, kind of leaflet. The police claimed that there was no trace of the Dagenham clan anywhere.
I found a reference to them in a fascist book. Apparently they were Hawkwind fans and they dressed like hippies. And according to this far-right autobiography, he said he knocked around with them for a short while, and they were a small group of people who looked like hippies from the outside, but they were from Dagenham and were particularly used to attack the local Sikhs, allegedly, according to this fascist book. I don't know how true, and you can take any of that, but yeah.
So they set up a rota because this couple were so terrified they couldn't sleep. The letterbox was sealed up because one of the things that were going on as well is that houses were being firebombed and they were pouring petrol through the letterbox in the middle of the night, throwing in a match. So they were too terrified to sleep. And friends of mine that went down there, I think it went on for a few weeks where this kind of rota was maintained. We collected mattresses. Mattresses were taken down there and they were put against the windows. So mattresses against the windows, the front door completely barricaded, and then somebody would sit on watch. So it would be like, I'm on watch duty for the next 3 hours, then you can take over. So that this couple who were at the back of the house could actually just go to sleep. So that was it. It's not... It was real defence. It was nothing to do with vigilantism or anything. And I think at Brick Lane as well, where the community had set up kind of patrols, which were kind of going around, and it was mostly the young Asian guys who had set up these patrols. And Vince Miller again had talked about going down there overnight and staying overnight to get the pitch at the top of the market. Well, the places where people were staying, one was in a pub that had a sympathetic, to the community landlord who basically said, yeah, you can sleep in the pub, and you could look down from, no, it wasn't that. And then the other place was a garment factory. So it was an Asian, kind of factory owner, and he'd let them stay overnight. So it had the support of the locals. They wanted the SWP, to be there because they didn't want the NF there at all. And yet it was couched in the terms of, that we were preventing the National Front from having legal demonstrations or, whatever, as if, well, they have a right to protest, they have a right to... What right did you have to interfere with it? And you think, well, hang on. They don't have the right to kind of go around attacking people and terrorising communities, so...
Let's be clear, those scumbags don't have a right to shit, man. They can fucking rot.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. But I think that really, that sense you've just given us there of like kind of the real violence that was coming from the far right, it wasn't coming over with the inquiry at all,
I suppose an analogy is like the way that the British state treated the South African apartheid regime, because it was anti-communist. They supported it both overtly and covertly. And similarly, the Nazis weren't seen as a threat because clearly they were anti-communist. So in terms of if you put in those Cold War terms, then that might, that's to give the broader context of why they were generally ignored or even tolerated.
Well, I have absolutely no doubt that if the British state needed to kind of get in bed with the fascists, they would, to maintain their power.
100%. And I think like it's such a, if the state had got away with like successfully suppressing the anti-fascist movement at that time, and the National Front had like been able to blossom in the way that they really wanted to, what kind of Britain would we be living in? And I mean, I think we owe a huge debt to people, of your generation who were part of the anti-fascist movement in the 70s for stopping the National Front in their tracks, because otherwise it could have got, as bad as it was, it could have got so much worse.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing is, you have to be ever vigilant, because it was defeated in the 30s. It took a nosedive in the early 80s or whatever, but it's never far away. I mean, you just have to kind of look around the world. You have to look at the far right in Europe that's rising up again. These people, it won't go away. Every generation, I think, was going to end up having to kind of fight back against it.
Because I think because those kind of social attitudes, like they serve the state really well. I mean, like, so, you know, in '77 the National Front, you know, came third in popular vote in the UK, and then I mean the reason they didn't do so well in '79 was because Thatcher's Tories had taken so many of the policies. And we see a really similar thing now with the current Conservative Party, you know, with the way in which that they've taken so much of the right wing's like kind of clothes, and they're wearing them. And I mean, we talk about like kind of what was the point of these undercover officers, and you know, like we said, they weren't there to stop any kind of individual event happening, but it was kind of, it's the slow war on social progress. I mean, that's what I believe anyway.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right.
Every time any kind of gains are made, sort of progressive gains of trade union activity or the welfare state or education system, I mean, I know loads of people sort of date, if you like, what's called neoliberalism to the start of like the early 70s, but really all those gains are under attack from the state from the very beginning. And I think you could, if you look at the undercover policing in that broader context, you can see why it happened, because part of the state is always trying to fight back against any kind of, you know, progressive gains in that any kind of social justice gains all the time from day one. And I think sometimes when we sort of zoom in on undercover policing, we kind of, because we're looking at the individual actions of the undercovers of the unit, that we sort of forget the broader context of that you know, there's always that reaction from the right, and it's continuous. It isn't then and now.
Well, it's class war. You know, simple as that. It's class war. That they would, the lengths that they took to basically stop Corbyn coming to power. And I suspect that any progressive, left government that comes in would face exactly the same problems. You know, this is the problem, isn't it? You know, all this talk about violence and all the rest of it, and you know, violent revolution, etc., etc. And you think, well, you know, no, we'd love a peaceful revolution actually, but you know, the state won't. They won't let it go. You know, they will not give up power. So what do we do?
Yeah, totally. And I think that, you know, the kind of there's so many things about like kind of. Like we've said about the context of the far right, but then the other context of like we talk so much about the covert policing, but the overt policing that you were experiencing at the time, you know, if we talk a bit about that, you know, the kind of that like as well as having these undercover officers in the movements, the way that they were like policing demonstrations, the way that they were, you know, like you were getting that kind of repression on the street from the police as well. I think that's been really missing from the context of the inquiry, you know.
I think we're now into double figures with the number of undercover police officers who were assaulted by their uniformed, I laugh because it is funny, by their uniformed colleagues. Yeah. You know, there is a lighter side to the inquiry.
There's always an upside. I had a couple of run-ins with the police, prior to, you know, sort of Vince Miller. And I can remember actually, and I think it was 1975, and for some reason, they decided to allow the British movement, I think it was the British movement, to assemble in Trafalgar Square. Now, there'd been a kind of like, you know, a ban on this. You weren't allowed to do it. They weren't allowed to stand up in Trafalgar Square. And then they decided that they would. So a crowd of us went down there, and we couldn't get anywhere near the square at all, because basically there were so many police everywhere, and they were up, you know, by the lions and all the rest of it. And so everyone was just kind of shouting from a distance and everything. And I was with a friend who had, and we were just standing around, and I had a friend who had a camera. So we'd taken this very nice, expensive camera down there to take some pictures of, you know, the fascists. So we were sort of standing slightly separately from everyone, nowhere near the police. Suddenly, I became aware that this couple of coppers standing probably, 20 feet away, something like that, pointed, and one of them shouted, "Get the camera, get the man with the camera." Suddenly, come flying over, knocked me out of the way, grabbed the guy, wrestled him to and we were so surprised All we were doing is taking a picture. And grabbed the camera. He's rolling around on the floor, and they're trying to pull the film out of the camera, and he's going, "Hey, don't break my camera. What's going on?" kind of thing. All I'm doing is taking a picture. And I'd been kind of pushed out of the way, and I instinctively, because my friend is rolling around on the floor with this one copper on him, the other copper that was kind of leaning over, I just sort of grabbed his shoulder, just not thinking, just grabbed his shoulder, like, "What are you doing?" And he fell over backwards. Then leapt up to turn around because I'm behind him, turned round, and I'm thinking, "Oh shit, sorry, he's gone down," and turned round with a fist like this, ready to punch whoever it was. Turned round and saw me, like, 5'3", 7.5 stone, looking kind of like a. And in those days, I looked very young for my age as well. And turned round, pulled his fist back as if I cannot hit this girl, and sort of put his arms round me in a bear hug, and he hissed in my ear, and he said, "Stop being a stupid little girl. Get out of this square now, as you're nicked, and your mate," kind of thing. And we were just left shocked, and this happened on a few. Not that didn't kind of exactly happen like that, but I can remember other occasions where we'd gone along at kind of anti-NF things, not got anywhere near them, and yet been crushed by the police, just push back. And I can remember being somewhere in the East End, and we were in a street being pushed back against shop fronts, big plate glass windows, and we were literally being crushed into them. And my friend, another friend that was with me, and we were really worried, thinking the window's going to go, we're all going to go through the glass, because it was literally, we're now being crushed. Nobody could breathe, nobody could get out, and they're moving forward and forward and forward. And then this door suddenly burst open because of the weight of the bodies, and everybody fell into this, they were kind of derelict shops, I think, fell into this hallway. And we then managed to kind of all kind of get into this hallway to kind of escape the crush, completely unprovoked. We weren't doing anything. So there were lots of things like that happening all the time, and just the general kind of attitude of the police it was fairly hostile at the time.
I mean, I think once you put those things together, of like kind of the far right given a free hand, essentially, the overt repression and the covert repression that was going on.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly dystopian reality of 1970s Britain.
It was, yeah.
That sense isn't the inquiry isn't operating with that sense in mind. It's like writing about the Second World War without mentioning Nazism or something. Do you know what I mean? It feels like this is the background that's going on. This is the context.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it was. I think the thing is, for a lot of people on the left, because the early sort of after 1968 and the early 70s, that there was a lot of lots of strikes. There was a lot of progress kind of being made, and people were beginning to think, yeah, it's all taking off. This is brilliant. Things are beginning to change, and then there was a kind of a downturn, and there was a downturn in kind of strike activity.
The dystopia descended.
Yeah, and a lot of people got really demoralised, very demoralised, when, I think, a lot of people at the time basically thought, oh God, the working class are just racist. They're just, they're kind of flocking to them. It was kind of depressing. And I think as well, there was a sense of panic, about, Christ, what's going to happen? If these people are gaining traction, they're getting votes and everything, and I think it was quite dark. So yeah, it was kind of necessity, really. We had to kind of organise and take them on, really.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank fuck you did, man. Jesus Christ, it could have been so much worse. So, going back to the inquiry, then. So, the day after you gave evidence, we heard Vince Miller's evidence. You watched that as well.
I did, yeah.
How did you find that experience?
I was absolutely dreading seeing him, because obviously in my mind, he's this 20-something, he's yeah, the whole thing has just been very, very strange, because obviously whenever, I rarely ever thought about him, but when I did, it's like, it's kind of something from the past. That's who he was, that's what happened, etc. Then to know that the whole thing was a bloody fiction, and that, he's just he's a spook, he's a phantom. It's just a very, had I known at the time, it would have had a devastating effect on me, I know, because I was quite I'm a pretty trusting person. In those days, I was quite naive, I was quite innocent, and I trusted people. I took them at face value, and, I was a bit of a a total romantic, let's put it that way, and always saw the best in everyone. I really did.
But that's good, right? That's how we should live. I mean, this is the great sort of danger of all this, is that, like, I mean, I'm the same. I take people at face value, and it's so, it's the worst thing about these infiltrations is that it somehow affects our characters, it affects our personalities, and like, we can't allow it to. We really can't allow it to.
No, that's right. Yeah, we just have to hang on to our humanity. I think, really, and that's the whole thing. It's kind of like, it's the antithesis. Their behaviour is the antithesis of everything that's good. It really is. It's like, without sounding like an old hippie kind of thing. It's like we have a message of love. We kind of. And yet their behaviour, it's just chilling and horrible. I just can't get my head around it, really. So I was dreading seeing him.
I kind of think of them as like butterfly collectors, them taking something beautiful and then killing it and put it in a book and to categorise it. Do you know what I mean? I don't know, maybe that's not such a good analogy. Taking something out of its context, but then file is what they did. They put it in the file and stuck it in this huge archive.
Yeah, well, it's dehumanising, isn't it? I'd really like to know, how. I mean, it doesn't sound as though they actually had that much training, but you kind of think, what did they have? Pictures of kind of like, this is a typical left-wing so-and-so. Who did they think we were? It's just beyond me, really. It's, this kind of othering of us, really, that we were some kind of, hooligan, subversive, troublemaking, enemy of the state, which this is the authoritarian mindset, I think, just saw us as a kind of bunch of, I don't know, just labels that meant nothing.
We talked about the Tradecraft Manual a little bit, and that was in some ways like an instruction book on how to dehumanise people. I don't know if you've had a look at that document very much. It was definitely very much labelling people. So, and I think it was like an induction on how to spy on people, to invade their lives without feeling bad about it, because they were sort of less than normal, less than human.
Yeah, one of the things the Tradecraft Manual did is assigned behaviours to the people who they were infiltrating, which were like patently impossible. Like, for one of them was like eating mold. These people ate mouldy food, and it's just not like, nobody does that, right? It's not a human behaviour. Like, it's part of that sort of that approach of just like, kind of, if they can dehumanise us all enough, then they can behave as complete psychopaths around us, and it's okay, because we're not really people.
And so it's like, how did they select them, or were they self-selecting? Just, well, I'm a psychopath, I'm gonna go for that job, or what?
I mean, they were already police officers, and I think this is the thing that I think is, like, to me, comes through a lot from the way they were talking about how Special Branch were at the time, and how the police are generally and always have been, is that that they weren't an anomaly within the police. This is just what cops are like.
When Chris was talking about the women's voice thing the other day, and you think, actually, when you think about all the the movements, the equality movements, whether it's equal pay, maternity leave, contraception, nurseries, all of the things would have benefited them as well. That's what's so crazy, is that it would have affected their wives, their girlfriends, their lives in general would have improved them. So it's how they've managed to compartmentalise, this stuff, or did they ever feel conflicted? That's what I'd really like to kind of ask them. Did you feel guilty or conflicted?
That was the classic thing we heard from Sandra during the first phase, who was the female undercover police officer. And it was pointed out that while she was infiltrating a group that were campaigning for equal pay, she was on, was it 80% or 70% of the wages of the other undercover officers that she was working alongside? I mean, it literally, we talk about false consciousness a lot, but that's such an example, isn't it?
I know, that's the word, false consciousness, yeah.
She did say that she was sympathetic to some of their ideas, wasn't she? And actually, to date, she is the only one who has outright said that she could have been doing something better with her time than spying on these groups.
But I think in terms of like the patriarchal attitude and the misogyny, that just shows how deep it is, and particularly within those either the establishment or the defenders of the establishment, is that even if it's in their own best interest, they're unwilling to recognise the legitimate demands of women, because you're women, so just shut up basically. That really, really is their attitude,
Yeah, stop being so angry.
Stop being so angry.
Literally, yeah. And we see that in the kind of Graham Coates was surprisingly open about that element of it. I think he was very closed about a lot of other things, but he's the way that he talks about the banter backroom culture that existed, which was very much like that.
I don't think that the police were actually that unusual in that either, really. I when I worked on the buses, my God, the banter you would have heard there, it was I think it's way less acceptable now, but I think back in the 70s, in largely male environments, I hate to say, for example, when I worked on the buses, it was it was a big bus garage, lots of drivers, very, very few women worked there, and in fact, walking into the canteen was an endurance test. You walked into the canteen, the first time you walked in, you would get maybe 150 blokes all turning round whistling and making comments, and you'd be thinking, oh my God. Yeah, and that's that happened frequently until they got to know you, kind of thing, or until you kind of challenged them in some way. But a woman that they'd never seen before comes in, and people that, and it was horrible, but it was acceptable behaviour, unfortunately.
I think that's another one of those social attitudes that the undercover police were part of the war against. Is that they were defending the continued existence of that kind of misogyny, and that part of their job was to defend the ability, men's right to wolf whistle at women. That was kind of part of it.
Yeah, it probably said in their job description is being on the wrong side of history. That is their job.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, there's such a narrow part, right, of what was going on at that time. There's such a narrow part of the reason why movements were oppressed, why kind of campaigns didn't succeed or succeeded against the odds. And this inquiry is only looking at a very small part of it. It's been quite frustrating in a lot of ways to really kind of bring out the kind of actually what was going on there. And it's not about, like you say, it's not about did you have a cover vehicle? It is about the attitudes of those officers and the attitudes of society at the time, and the way in which something which Diane Langford said earlier during this phase was that as much as there's been this big thing, we can't judge people then by the morals of now, the ethics of now are different, but there was plenty and you're a testament that you lived through those time. There were people who weren't sexist, who weren't racist, who weren't homophobic, and that we do a disservice to all of them by pretending they didn't exist back then. And that's what the inquiry, the police sort of input to the inquiry keeps trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Yeah.
And Graham Coates was as much as I hate to give him any credit, he was quite good in that, and he said that even within the context of the 1970s, the language and the jokes made within the Special Demonstration Squad safe house would be unacceptable to most people, even at the time.
Yeah, Yeah, I can believe it. Yeah. Did you actually see him giving evidence?
Yeah.
or-
Yeah, we
Oh,
did.
you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it was quite interesting. He had do you know Kropotkin's beard? He'd stylized his beard in the same way. You know, it's a goatee that fans out. He had that on the go, and I really felt like when it was put to him, he was like the anarchist police officer. He looked so chuffed. It really annoyed me. I was like, "Fuck you, man! You don't get to be in the gang. You're not in the gang. You can piss off." You know.
I mean, it was basically anarchism was his hobby, and he got to do it and got paid for it for like 3 or 4 years. And like, you know, he got to meet one of his big idols, Albert Meltzer. You know, he's like, oh, he's like amazing. You know, not I mean, basically, I think he saw it as I say as a hobby instead of like train spotting or stamp collecting. He did that and got paid for it.
Which is really annoying because it was basically a large part of my life was being a bit of a geek about anarchism, and I never got bloody paid.
So he was a bit of a kind of anarchist groupie, do you think?
So I hope I'm not going to offend you here, but because initially he was deployed to the SWP, but left because it was a bit the meetings were boring. So he thought it might be more fun with the anarchists, which, you know, me and Tom might agree with. But anyway.
Let's not get too sectarian here. Yeah.
No, that's okay.
But yeah, it did seem he basically did what he liked. Amongst other things, he said he pretty much conceded that all the people, as far as he knew, none of the people that he actually spied upon, which included spying on a residential house with a young family, they didn't pose a threat, as far as he knew anyway.
No, and I think it was obvious, wasn't it, halfway through, you know, a few months deployment in any of these groups, and you'd have thought that they'd be saying, well, I can't see any subversion here. What am I doing here? You know, but that didn't seem to kind of cross anyone's mind.
But that's because it's like it literally wasn't about that, and I think it was about the war on social progress. It was about the war on attitudes, and it was a slow war, and like I think on a lot of things they kept a lot of things alive that should have been stamped out. You know, I mean, like whether it's the far right, whether it's the misogyny, you know, these were the issues. These are what they're actually there to do. You know, I think maybe a lot of them believed it was about public disorder and subversion, but I think that there's, you know, I think further up, you know, there was more of a sort of understanding that it's just like keeping down the lefties, you know, keeping down left-wing attitudes.
Yeah, keeping our tabs on them, getting their names, you know, working out where they lived and all the rest of it, you know, because we never know when we're going to have to round them up.
Well, I mean, yeah, that was the other thing. I mean, like with Vince Miller's evidence, he was, you know, you got the impression that literally if you had ever picked up a copy of Socialist Worker in his area, he'd have been to your house. Because I think so many of us knew that undercover police existed whilst we were active. But we always thought that they were like what we've heard about a lot from the inquiry, but what officers were doing before they became undercover officers, where they were like plainclothes special branch officers going to meetings and demonstrations, you know, and I always thought that was kind of what undercover police were, you know, and it's that kind of thing of the more you learn about it, the more the depth that they would go to, you know, it was so much deeper than we ever realised, you know.
Yeah, it's sinister. Yeah, even that, you know, they could have walked into any public meeting, sat down, recorded what got said. They wouldn't have known the names of the people that were there. So obviously that's a big part of it, gathering the information on the individuals. But in terms of, you know, the broad ideas and all the rest of it, you know, most of the groups were completely open. You know, anyone could kind of turn up. Anyone could. There were no secret cabals, no kind of, you know, underground bomb-making things going on. At least not to my knowledge, anyway. But do you know what I mean? It's like they could have got that information anyway. Just pick up the Socialist Worker if you want to know what the politics are, or Freedom Press or whatever. You know.
Yeah, but they wanted to know the address of anybody who ever bought a copy. Their desire for knowledge was so much deeper than like. It's almost like what's the point? But it's that strength of the tentacles of the state. They really felt secure. Like you say, if when it came to the point where they had to round us all up, they knew where we all lived.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the fact that they could find me, however many years later, I mean, you know, that was another aspect of it. You know, when they got in touch with me, you know, I was kind of thinking, God, they found me really easily, didn't they? And you know, then this worry that if I stick my head up and, you know, start saying, yeah, this is who I am, kind of thing, are they going to turn up again? Will the monitoring increase again? You know, that they may have I might have been lying dormant for a few years, but suddenly it could increase again, or that the far right, might suddenly, decide that they're going to chuck a brick through my window or something, or worse,
In terms of the flow of information, we now know that it wasn't just Special Branch who were interested in this collection of massive of information, but it's MI5 as well, which I think before the beginning of the actual hearings, we were aware that MI5 was somehow involved, but we didn't think they were. I suppose, perhaps mistakenly, we thought they'd be interested in more serious stuff, or more, I suppose, Soviet stuff, and more, and that kind of thing. But it seems that they also had an absurd interest in the trivia of, for instance, of the membership of, for instance, was it Walthamstow SWP branch? They wanted all the names. I mean, and this is MI5.
Well, not just the names. They wanted to know where you worked, whether you were in the union, how much you earned, physical descriptions of everyone, who you lived with, physical descriptions of them, how much they earned. All the networks, who was friends with who was, who was married to who, everything. They wanted to know, every aspect of your life, really.
I think that's why when we look at how Big Flame reacted when they outed Rick Gibson, and they discovered he was an undercover cop, and there was when we initially first heard about that, a lot of us were like, oh, well, why didn't they make a fuss about it then? We could have, but the reality of it was they were fucking terrified. They were so terrified from discovering what appeared to be an undercover police officer in their unit that they put the information in a sealed envelope and then gave it to someone saying, only release this if something happens to a member of Big Flame. And it's that fear that, the fear you just expressed, I think is, it's a totally rational fear to have, because, it's something that I definitely found after Marco Jacobs, we kind of unearthed him. I was like, well, do I really want to make a fuss out of this? First time they sent a jokey guy into my life. Who do they send next? Who's the next person they send in?
Well, I think, after that initial inquiry contact, I did actually start to feel quite paranoid. Just kind of, just thinking there's all this unknown, suddenly all this unknown stuff, who's been spying on me? When did it start? When did it stop? Who else have they been spying on? Are they still, that whole thing? And I really did feel that, it was like there was this big eye in the sky looking at me, kind of thing. It did, the idea of having any privacy went out the window. I just felt, they possibly know every single thing about me. I've always been really careful with social media and stuff like that. I'm always thinking you're giving so much stuff away, Facebook, all the rest of it, yeah. And I've always been kind of aware of that. But yeah, I did actually feel quite exposed for a while. And then I just kind of thought to myself, fuck it. It's just going to... If they want to know what I think now, I'm going to tell them.
Fucking right. Absolutely. And I think it's such a fine line for us as activists who are making a fuss about all this stuff. It's been such a fine line to kind of encourage people to be aware of it, but also not be paranoid. You don't want people to be cowed into inaction because they're scared of the state.
Yeah, you can't live in fear. You can't live in fear. No, you need to stick your head up. And, and I think, we've had, there's a lot of kind of historic examples, I suppose, of people, total heroes, complete heroes. I'd never compare myself to any of these people, but, there's, sometimes you just have to stand up and be counted, don't you? Even though you might be quaking inside and thinking, oh God, sometimes you just have to.
Well, thank you for joining us. We'll have you back on the show some other time. And cheers.
Okay, can I just say you're doing a brilliant job. You're trying to get it all out there to lots of people. And thank you for inviting me, both of you.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you.
Thank you, dude. Cheers. If you want to know more about this topic or stay up to date with what we're doing, check out spycops.info. We're grateful to the campaign opposing police surveillance for supporting us so we could buy some microphones, and to Le Pub for giving us studio space. We'd really like to improve more. If you're able to help, please get in touch.